there is now going to be a wrongful death lawsuit against the CABO 6 and also FBI agencies, etc. Now, within these court documents, we finally have the interview on Carolina, who was the general doctor who was at the villa the time that Shanquella Robinson deceased. A lot of shocking details in here, just so that you guys know. But what we're gonna do in this video is go through it. Approximately around 2:13, she's informed by WhatsApp a message that a medical assistance is needed at the Los Cabo place where they were staying, at the villas, right? She ends up going there. She arrives around 3:15, so 1 hour later. And basically, she was greeted by a male person of dark complexion, slim built, English speaking, approximately 25 years old, and as well as a female of dark complexion, of regular build, dressed in blue, approximately 26-year-old, which was most likely Dejanay, and a tall African-American person of stocky build with a bulging cap on his head, approximately 28 years old. And they basically showed her where Shanquella was, and according to this interview, she saw Shanquella sitting on the couch with her head resting on a top edge of the couch and the rest of her body resting on the couch, covered in a light blanket from chest down and wearing a blouse. She doesn't remember the details of it, and purple leggings, and her eyes were open. She was disheveled, dehydrated, and her lips were dry. She wasn't able to articulate any words, but she was only able to make sounds. Now, there is a reason for that, and I will explain more of that in part 2, so make sure to hit the subscribe button with notification and hit that like so you get notified when I upload that video. But trust me when I say that there is so much to this story that not even the doctors have been talking about it, but due to me looking into things, I've kind of came up with a reasoning. And she actually, yes, she was not actually officially dead at that time, but trust me, you're gonna have to watch part 2 of this video so you guys really understand where I'm coming from. Again, this is my hypothesis. The doctor did notice that she had a blow to the forehead on the right side of Shanquella. She didn't feel any deformities when she felt Shanquella's skull, and that Shanquella had a poor response to light, which I'm assuming is when they have the torch and they're shining it in your lights, the medical torch. And she ended up calling Shanquella's name to try to get a reaction from Shanquella. So what she did, she ended up putting her body at the same length as Shanquella's body to try to get her attention. And that's when she's like, okay, Shanquella really needs to go to the hospital. She proceeded to take vital signs like temperature, heart rate, respiratory rate, pulse saturation, and blood pressure. Also had a right conjunctival hemorrhage, which is where Shanquella's eye is. Her eye was basically severely damaged. And my question is, like, when she saw this, did like any light bulb go in her head like, oh, this woman has been beaten up? Because once we go further through this interview, nothing's really mentioned about the others saying what happened to her forehead or her eye. She ended up checking Shanquella's heart and lungs, and she didn't hear any abnormal sounds. But she did notice that Shanquella's nails were painted. Maybe she meant clear paint, you know, the seafood paint. And she basically pressed on Shanquella's nails to see, like, if you press hard on your nail and release it, it'll take a couple of seconds until your nail goes back to a normal color. And that's basically what she did, and she found that it was delayed in Shanquella's nails. And that's when she was like, okay, Shanquella is dehydrated. And she told the CABO 6 this, and she goes, yes, she's dehydrated, but she still really needs to go to a hospital to be evaluated. She basically asked them if she had any history of drug use, allergies. The others said no. And she continued asking them how much alcohol did Shanquella consume and what type of alcohol she consumed. And they answered back by saying she had countless and many types of alcohol. And the person who told her this was Alyssa, which she describes as someone, as she describes in the interview, interview as someone really tall with very long hair. She names this person number 1 in the interview. And then she said Dejanay said that Shanquella had drunk a lot. She then proceeds to ask everyone how they were related to Shanquella, and they basically told her they're friends of Shanquella and used to go to college. Now, 2 people were helping her with Shanquella's assessment. That was Winter, and from my understanding was Nazir. She describes this person as slim, dark skin. Now, Dejanay and Winter requested that they get seen at this address, right? And I'm assuming they wanted doctors to go there to see her there. Alyssa then tells Katrina that Shanquella has been like this before and she used to get better with hydration. She tells them, look, she will be better taken care of at the hospital. She can proceed with hydration, but she needs an assessment at the hospital to continue her care. She needs to go immediately, and that they needed to contact a family member to find out if they would be in charge, since there were no direct family members at the villa. And according to Katrina, they were reluctant, and Winter and Dejanay end up telling her that they have the means to pay her, but they did not have any money to pay an expensive hospital bill, which is quite common in Mexico, right? Especially in the tourist spots. You got to be really careful, because when you go to these private hospitals, they can really upcharge you. I'm talking like $60,000. Yes, crazy amount of money like that. And Katrina, which was very nice of her in my opinion, she didn't want to receive any money because she's taking into account, but there's going to be cover costs of the materials either on site or outside. And she insisted them of taking her to a hospital and that she could go to a public hospital because there will be no charge. Which I found very interesting, that there would be no charge at all, but maybe she means no charge like on site, maybe afterwards. And she told them to ask Shanquella's family if she had any type of insurance and that they needed to start calling the family. The other member of CABO 6 ended up staying with Katrina to help hold her hand to place an IV in Shanquella, while the others were going to find out if Shanquella had insurance, etc. And this is when Dejanay and Winter called someone. Now, it's not sure who they called. I'm assuming most likely Salamaja, Shanquella's mother, and they were basically telling about Shanquella's condition and that they needed to make the decisions, and they insisted during the call that Shanquella was only dehydrated and only needed an IV, and that I was insisting on taking her to a hospital, but they had no money. While this was happening, Katrina ended up calling her boss, and which he responded to her, look, if you feel that it's necessary for Shanquella to go to the hospital, improvise that to their friends to take her to the hospital. And if they refuse, that they cannot move Shanquella in any circumstance. And if they don't accept or make any decisions, that Katrina should leave the villa. Informs the others that she is not able to put an IV in Shanquella because she's dehydrated and that she cannot speak well, which someone in the CABO 6 end up making excuses saying, well, we can't take her because we do not have a car. And that's when Katrina goes, okay, well, you can call 911 or look for some way to get her to a hospital. And this is when they're turning around saying, well, it will cost money. And of course, we know now that they didn't care about her or care about getting some type of help, because most likely they would have found out what happened and they wouldn't be able to stick with their lives. They'll probably most likely get in trouble. And then they end up turning around going, okay, well, so what hospital could we take her to? What public hospital? And she basically told them the nearest public hospital. It also says here they deliberated again, and I tell them that I'm going to leave. They tell me that they were already checking with her relatives to see if she had insurance and asked me to try to place the IV one last time. For the third time, I tried to place an IV on her left arm and I succeeded. But when I tried to secure the IV, she began to have generalized tonic-clonic convulsions. At that moment, Alyssa and I believe Nazir, during the compulsions when the IV came out, she ends up compressing her hand, right? And they got scared. Katrina ends up telling them, like, look, don't move her body. And she told them not to put anything in her mouth, that they now really need to call 911. And apparently Winter turned around and told her to do it herself. And she told Winter, no, you need to do this because I'm taking care of Shanquella. And this is when she realized that Shanquella's sphincter had relaxed. And apparently Nazir, or again it could be one of the other guys, told her that she had peed already, which changed Katrina's perspective on the situation and reinforced the need of complete reevaluation and a complete imaging study with urgent hospital attention and transfer by ambulance. After a few minutes, Shanquella's body stopped convulsing. This is when Katrina realized that the other members of CABO 6 were gone and the only people that stayed was Winter and Mel number 1 were the only two that stayed with her. I then proceeded to monitor her vital signs as much as I could. I requested support to post on her airway and verify that 911 is being called. Winter called and passes me her phone. I report a female in post-article state. I request an urgent unit. I notice that abnormal sounds are heard in her breathing, rales, and it's difficult to open airways due to the tremors. According to AI, trismus is commonly known as a lockjaw, is a medical condition characterized by an inability to fully open a mouth due to muscle spasms in the jaw. I've never heard that word before. That's probably why I'm mispronouncing it. And her saturation was low. By this time, an hour had passed. It's a little bit hard to understand, but it says patient with pulse, increased respiratory effort, help is requested from one friend left within my reach, who is the male identified as 1, to look for a hard plastic tube to keep her mouth open. He then asked her, can she transfer Shanquella to a hospital in her car? Which she responds to him like, look, Shanquella's in a serious condition and she needs to be transferred in an ambulance. Like, putting her in a car would do more harm than good, basically, from what it sounds like. Which he ends up leaving and she is left alone with Shanquella. And she's trying to position Shanquella's airway. She then checked Shanquella's pulse at 16:49 and she detected without a pulse. Verbally, I shouted to them, she no longer has a pulse, I need help. The thin girl, Alyssa, panics and leaves. Number 1, a male, helps me lower her to the floor next to the couch and placed her in a flat position. She calls 911, indicates this was a follow-up to the previous report that the patient is now in arrest. CPR is basically initiated and she's ended up giving Shanquella compression. Nazir, I'm guessing, helping her with rescue vitalization until the Red Cross ambulance ends up coming. And I believe this is when we see the photos of Shanquella near the sofas on the floor. Now after the Red Cross, 5 minutes later, Shanquella goes into arrest. Katrina ends up asking the Red Cross if they can take her to the hospital. And they refuse. They say they can't take her to the hospital unless she has a pulse. And 3 other ambulances end up coming to the scene. Most likely these are private hospitals, and they all told Katrina the same thing, that they could not take her to a hospital without a pulse. Now one of the paramedics end up placing an IV, and the other 3 responders join in to try to save Shanquella. The AED device is placed and were advised not to discharge. Immediately a eligible cannula is placed and ventilation with a bag mask. I am informed that there is a laryngeal mask, but it cannot be placed because there is still trismus, because that's her mouth being locked or whatever. And she's insisting of transferring Shanquella to the hospital. This is when they end up giving her 5 adrenalines to try to save her, until they accept her advice and that they were told via monitor to discharge, and defibrillation was performed. Which is basically those electric machines that they put on your chests. That's how you pronounce it. I didn't know that. So that was performed 6 times, and the monitor was placed with a systolic trace, and her friends were informed that there was no response. After approximately 1 hour of maneuvers, I informed one of her friends, identified as male number 2, a regular build, dark complexion, bold, bearded, that would have been Nazir, who asked me why they did not take her to the hospital, to which I replied that, and she basically tells him no paramedic accepted to transfer her to the hospital because of her condition. Apparently Nazir was shaking and he left the scene.
The paramedics informed me that there was no longer any motor response, that the monitor showed asystole, and that there was no adrenaline left. In that condition, they were not going to transfer her. Another attempt at resuscitation was made, but no pulse was detected. She remained in asystole, and there was no motor response. Her pupils were dilated, and there was no pupillary or corneal response. So she was declared deceased.
Was declared dead at 17:57, at 17 hours and 57 minutes. Now, when they were doing the third round of maneuvers and trying to save Shanquella, the police had already arrived at the scene and they didn't interfere with anything of what the doctors were doing. They were basically staying out of the way. There was only one time when they asked about Shanquella's condition and how she was. Now, after she was declared deceased, I waited for them to finish interviewing one of the Red Cross paramedics, as he was one of the first to arrive in the ambulance. One of the officers took my statements, and about 10 minutes before the end of the interview, the administrator arrived in the office and told me I could not leave yet, and I stayed there for 15 more minutes, and I left around 19 hours and 30 minutes.